Hello, everyone, and welcome to our continuation of commemorating a Portuguese Immigrant Week in California. It is indeed always wonderful to commemorate this week as the second week of the month of March was decreed in 1967 by then Governor Ronald Reagan, and has been a resolution that's been signed by every single governor since 1967. So this is the 55th Portuguese Immigrant Week in California, signed, of course, this year by Governor Gavin Newsom. And our topic for this talk, as part of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute commemoration of the Portuguese Immigrant Week in California, is the SPRSI and the Portuguese Women Movement in California. And for those watching us live, welcome, and fitting because today is International Women's Day. So it is fitting for the day as well. Our invitee is Tisha Cardoza, who, for those of you who don't know, is my prima. That's just, putting out everything that should be laid out, so people don't think that I'm favoring my relatives. She's not really my prima, but she is in a way. And Tisha, welcome to our commemoration. Welcome to this, which is also going to be recorded as part of our Portuguese oral history project. And Tisha has been she is one of the most interviewed in our oral history project with different projects that she's part of, because she has lots of stories, especially her involvement in the Portuguese American community. So again, welcome, Tisha, to this presentation, this conversation about SPRSI and the Portuguese American women in California.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the invite. It's truly my honor to be able to be here with you today.
Oh, no, it's our privilege. And so let's talk a little bit about, first of all, I know that the lady who was responsible for you getting involved in SPRSI and the hall and everything else, your grandmother, one of your grandmothers, would be, actually, both of them were commemorating their birthday today, but the Portuguese one would have been 97 had she been alive. So happy birthday to her in heaven. And we're thankful that she had such an influence on you.
Yes. Thank you. I was truly blessed, and I'm grateful every day for all the things she instilled upon me. And as we've talked about before, it wasn't always my choice to be a part of, but forced me to, so that I grew a love and a fondness for all the different organizations and the hall and St. Isabel, of course, and Holy Spirit and my Portuguese culture in general. She was always an advocate to make sure we knew where we came from. So
let's talk a little bit about the SPRSI. So you got involved in the SPRSI because of her. So probably you had a policy ever since you were a little girl.
Yeah. So I'm 43 years old. So since 1978, I've been a member of SPRSI. The grand president at the time was Maria Lessig. It's kind of a thing, we refer to our president, meaning the person that was president when we got our policy. So Maria Lessig is my president. She was from Sausalito, Sebastopol area. And my grandmother put me in. It was just kind of the common thing. I was the first granddaughter on that side. So first grandchild, period, but definitely. And then I was a granddaughter. So I was instantly put in. If I remember right, I'm born October 28th. And my policy was enforced as of November 23rd. Which turned out to be my baptism day as well. So I've been a member for 43 years, almost 44. And it's kind of a family tradition. My grandmother, my mother, but it started with my great-grandmother, my grandmother's mother. She got involved with SPRSI and held the office of Grand Director in the 1940s when they started allowing juveniles, as they called them then. She had I actually have it. It's a gold cross she was given for putting in 50 juvenile members that first year to start the juvenile movement, I guess you would say, because before then you had to be 16 to join. So, and then my great-grandparents, or my great-grandmothers, both my grandfather's mother was also a member. So it was on both sides of the Portuguese side, as it is. In fact, when they allowed juveniles in, my grandma always said the first, but I will have to say probably one of the first. Fourth generations was in my family. My grandmother, I guess my oldest aunt, but my mother was already born as well. And then her mother, and then her grandmother was alive still at that time. And then on my grandfather's side, his mother and his grandmother were alive at the same time. So they kind of had it both sides, so to speak. And there's a picture that my grandma always had on the wall at her house, commemorating the first fourth generations, as she would say. And then I came along. I'm a fifth generation member. However, the way it works in our traditions, you're only recognized for those that are alive, so to speak. So at the time I was born, I was lucky enough to still have my great grandmother on my grandfather's side. His mother was still alive. So I was considered a fourth generation member, and what they give you is a beautiful Saint Isabel rosary at the time. So I still have that. So it's a long-standing tradition. So my great grandmother, I remember going to the first convention that I went to as a teenager, and a woman, her name was Mary Moberg. She was also a past grand president. She was from the San Leandro area, worked in our home office in Oakland for years as well, if people know her. She came up to me and she goes, "Are you related to Mary J. Silva?" And I said, "Yes." I said, "That's my great grandmother." And she goes, "You look just like her." I said, "I get that often. It's the rosy cheeks because I get nervous and shy all the time." But so it's kind of nice. It was nice that someone who had never met me, but just by the way I looked and because I resembled, I didn't get a chance to meet her. She passed away, I think it's either a month or a year before I was born. I'm a little off on my dates at the moment, but
Sure.
I didn't get a chance to meet her, but to know that I, just by looking at me, someone recognized, and I was able to learn about her through the society as well, as far as her works there and what a nice woman she was and how open and welcoming. And when the grand presidents traveled, they always stayed with her, and she fed them well and took them to get members all over the place. And it was an amazing experience. And that was my first one. And I haven't been to all of them ever since, but a good majority.
I would think so, yes. So SPRSI has been part of your life. I mean, as you said, from birth on. About the organization itself. So we're talking about an organization that is how old now?
It was founded March 15th of 1898.
1898. So right before, a couple of years before the turn of the century of the 19th to 20th century. So young people don't think it was, 1998. So 1898. So we're talking about 124 years, basically.
A few days.
Yeah. And so a little bit about, it's interesting because that's about 20, 30 years after the so-called male organizations were founded. And I just, in 1898, there weren't a lot of women movements in different parts of society. This is before all of the empowerment of women began, in the 20th century. What do you think, from talking to your grandmother and from talking to some of the elders, now at my age, I've become the elder, but, we're talking about maybe 20 years ago or so. From talking to some of those who have either passed or aged, but who knew some of these older folks, what do you think drove these women to do this from your perspective?
As you said, we were founded March 15th, 1898 as an altar society is how they started. It was 30 women, St. Joseph's Catholic Church on 7th Avenue there in Oakland. And I've often thought, and when I was grand president of the organization, I often would speak about how, I thought how it all started. And I often thought that it probably started at, a kitchen table. That's where I think a lot of things probably start. There was no cars. Horse and buggy days. So the women gathered, probably after church. They might have seen their husbands being in the male organizations like the UPC, the IDS, of the world, and thought, they could do something just the same because they were, excluded from being in as a member I'm sure they were allowed to, cook meals and, help at the halls and clean and all of that kind of items, but they weren't able to have that that confidence and that involvement and those honors really at the end of the day. So I can only imagine, in 1898 again, women can't vote. They're most likely, most of all of them were immigrants, the first 30 women, so probably were not educated at all or very little. Most were wives, from what history tells us. So they pretty much stayed at home, took care of the kids. If they worked, it was more labor positions, factories, maybe agriculture, laundry, cleaning, those types of things. And the one thing they had was this altar society that they formed, and it was theirs. And I believe it was in 1901, they had seven councils already. And those 7 councils met, and I believe it was January 20th of 1901. The 7 councils met. I think there was 43 people, if I remember correctly, 43 ladies. 43 ladies met, and they decided that they were going to take it to a next step and start having officers and having a convention. So July, our convention used to be the second weekend of July after the feast day of St. Isabel, which is July 4th. And in 1901, they started their line officers with their 7 councils. And our first grand president was our founder, Rosa M. Oliveira. And she served. And I can only imagine just the drive and inspiration she must have had. How much came from just St. Isabel in general, for being our patron saint. Here was a woman who in the 13th century sells her crown and loves her people so much, and took on more of a role than perhaps a typical queen would have had back in those days. For becoming a queen, I believe at the age of 12 is when she was married, if I remember right. So I don't know how much they drew from that, because that was the patroness saint of their altar society, and of course they know the stories better than we do. I'm sure, or better than I do, I should say, at least. And I know quite a few, but I can just imagine, again, I think they just sat around a table and were like, if they can do it, we can do it. And they just found the gumption, the drive. And I'm sure they were told no quite a bit, but they didn't let them, stop them. They were like a train moving towards, and you either got on the train or you got out of the way, because they were just barreling through, and this was their goal. And you see it today. I'm a very shy person, but being part of SPRSI, I wanted to be involved, and they don't let you be shy. Like, I remember being like I said, a kid, and they instantly grab you and you're a part of them. And I just imagine these 30 women, they already had their Portuguese roots and their Catholic faith all together, and they just used all of that together. And as a force, they were, meant to be reckoned with, and really paved the way.
And so I would imagine from the Altar Society, and of course the setting up, as you just told us, of the society itself, SPRSI-Sociedade Portuguesa da Rainha Santa Isabel, it seems like then, of course, they started building the same kind of concept as all of the other fraternal organizations, not just Portuguese, also other ethnic groups have had them, and some still do. And they started setting up councils. Has there always been, since you've been involved, and you've been involved through your grandmother at a very young age, have you always seen a strong involvement in the valley, or has there been other parts, or what parts of the state have a bigger tradition, or is it pretty much evenly divided? What are your thoughts?
So I know the first 7 councils were all around the Bay Area. Oakland is Council 1. I know Council 7 was Benicia, 2 Pleasanton. I think 3 was San Jose or Santa Clara area. Not all of them are around today, but
sure.
Mostly the Bay Area. Here, based on the number system, I think the earliest council here in the valley would be Council 42 of Hanford, which is still here today. And so they have to be, 100 and something years old as well.
Sure.
I know Council 70 in 1990, it was 1992, which was Selma, which is the first council I belonged to. It celebrated its 100th. So Council 42 had to have come quite a bit before then. And So I would say the councils eventually grew from the original 7 to 151, I believe, and went from Eureka down to San Diego and
Wow.
all in between. Little towns, Coarsegold used to have one, Corcoran used to have a council. All these little towns that you've never, or I should say, I've not necessarily heard of. There was an SPRSI council, some big, some small, same thing with any of the organizations really.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the Valley, the largest councils have always been from the Valley. For years, it was our Atwater Council. It's been the Hanford Council, as they fight back and forth and gain members and lose members, and it becomes competition. And that was always kind of cool to see. And how many members do you get? And it was there was a tradition that the Grand President's cake always had roses on it, because that's obviously our flower after St. Isabel. And depending on how many members you were going to give the Grand President, you put that many roses on your cake. So when the Grand President came in, if there was 1 rose on the cake, she knew she was getting 1 member. If it was covered in roses, she could get 10, 20, 30, 40, who knows how many it was back in the day.
So that was done from council to council when the visit.
Yes.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful concept. Yeah. Very creative.
I don't know when it started. I don't know if it's, 124 years old kind of thing, but definitely in my lifetime, so the last 40 something years, it was definitely a tradition. Some councils get away from cakes these days, and being Grand President, you're okay not to eat cake every weekend. So they don't all do the cakes anymore, but those that do, some of them still carry on the I guess the tradition.
Right.
But always in the Valley here, always a big presence. Right. Several councils. We used to have district directors, and this district was always the largest as far as footprint. Mm-hmm. And the district director's job was to, in the absence of the Grand President, because she obviously had other duties, they were to attend meetings. If councils had issues, that was your go-to person. They did your installation if the Grand President couldn't come do it. The director was also a big position, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so they would also have little meetings, kind of like mini conventions in a way, to discuss what was important to our area before we went to convention, like little caucuses, so to speak, mm-hmm. So that we were all on the same mind path, and we were going to get what we wanted because we were the Valley and we're the strongest. And if you look at the past Grand Presidents, I don't have a count, but there's quite a few from the Valley. And in fact, those alive today, I'm pretty sure the vast majority are here between in the Valley. Now, as a disclaimer, I live in Selma, but technically my council is currently San Mateo, Council 43. When I lived up there for work for 2 years, I transferred my council, and I've stayed because they're a great bunch of ladies.
Sure.
So I'll claim both areas.
Yeah, there you go. I'm sure you continue to work for both of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so, as you said, in 1898, I would think that all of these women were immigrants, because immigration had only been here for, in numbers for about 25 years or so, and then throughout the years, in your experience, in your lifetime that you've been involved, in the last 20, 25 years or so, when you have these, it seems like we've had, young people such as yourself and Erica who are, in their 30s and 40s. We've had older people, and there's been a mix, or correct me if I'm wrong, of both first, second, third, fourth, fifth generation Portuguese Americans. So those whose great grandparents or great grandparents immigrated, or grandparents. And there's also been immigrants. I'm thinking of one, our friend Maria Fernanda Simões from Hanford, who was an immigrant, and she's been president quite a few years ago. And I know how much that meant to her as an immigrant to be president of SPRSI. So has there been a mix of both in your that you've noticed, or has it been more born here and not immigrants? And obviously in the last few years it had to be born here, because we have not had any immigration to speak of for the last 35 years.
Yes, I would say definitely since I was president, and I was president from 2008, 2010, they've all been going through my head real quick, so I do not want to misspeak, but they have all been born here.
Okay.
I'm a third generation born here. My grandparents were born here, and actually my grandmother's father was born here. So third, fourth, depending on how you want to look at it. So I'm quite more removed. But then, like Maria Fernanda, like you said, she was grand president. I'm gonna say early 90s, 92 kind of pops in my head.
Right. Yeah. It was in the 90s. I know that for a fact. Yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
and so she was an immigrant, obviously. My godmother, my madrina, Denisa, who was grand president, I think around 2000, 99, 2000, and she was an immigrant. So she might have been Maria George.
So
She's
it's been a
from the Fort Bragg area.
combination of both. Yeah.
There's quite a combination. Yeah, I'm probably
Mhm.
honestly the furthest removed. Because even our youngest grand president to date is Constance Brazil, but even herself, she's only a first generation. Her parents
Correct.
were born the Azores.
Right.
So for her being the youngest, you know, there's quite a mix. But and so I would say I'm definitely probably one of the further ones out, probably throughout the entire history, to be honest. Growing up as a teenager, so it would have been the 80s, the 90s, most were either first generation or immigrants. They weren't too far removed. You know, you were not looked fondly upon if you couldn't speak Portuguese. And as the generations go, you know, including myself, you know, we lose the language for multiple reasons. So they tended to be mostly immigrants or first generations, I think. I think if you were to look at our history of the 124 years, there's roughly probably 22 grand presidents, because two of us have served 2 terms. 122 grand presidents. I would say the majority are immigrants, followed by first generation, maybe a few second and third, and then you got me out in the long edges out there, the fourth.
And then we have you, and we'll have more of you, hopefully, because as we continue without immigration, we will have more and more, hopefully, in the future. Of course, that will have to be 3rd, 4th, 5th generation. How, without, of course, knowing some of these women, and other than what the stories that you've heard, and that I've heard some of them, not even 10% of what you heard, but how, you know, thinking about history and thinking about the role of women in the United States and in our community. I mean, I just saw in a Portuguese newspaper, and just the context, to put the question in context, I just saw in a Portuguese newspaper in the East Coast that the Luso-Americano in Newark, New Jersey, where they made, it was headline, you know, front page, 12 women for the first time became, there's 12 clubs and associations in the East Coast in different states, New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, etc., that these 12 clubs for the first time ever, and these are clubs that are 50, 60, 80 years old, have for the first time ever a woman president. The Portuguese halls haven't had that many women president. I recall, I know, of course, the pictures of the Selma Hall and your grandmother there being probably one of the very first ones, if not the very first one. The Portuguese festas have had very few women present, a little bit more in the Bay Area, but certainly not in the Southern California or here. How do you think these women felt, or how much important was SPRSI, even more than what the women felt, to empower women? Because the entire organization was ran by them. It's not like, you know, so how much was this, from your perspective, empower them in a society, in a community that everywhere else they did not have any power?
I think it was very instrumental. Again, going from, you know, I guess as you would say, the common housewife, where only the wealth of your husband determined your social class. But here you could be of any social class in SPRSI, and you could go to these meetings, you know, once a month. And then if you were lucky enough, you got to go to convention once a year. And it had to have been one of, probably just short of God and their immediate family, it had to be up there as far as what was instrumental and important to them, because they made such a commitment. And if you were to get into the line to be an officer, or to eventually be grand president, which was the end goal, if you get into the line of officers, it was going to be a commitment of a year away from your family for the most part. We've heard the stories of the grand presidents being gone from their family for weeks at a time as they're forming councils in the early years, gaining members in the early years. And they're traveling horse and buggy and train. So the travel is not, you and I today can get to San Diego in 5 hours. It was probably a day or more, depending on the time frame we talk about, whether train was available or horse and buggy, and they just made it happen. And so I think it was because it made them feel special. It was a way for them to honor the great devotion they had to our patroness saint, Queen Saint Isabel. I mean, they put in our prayer that our duty is to imitate the beauty of her virtues. And I think that was their goal and that was their drive. And I was once told by one of our past grand presidents, Bertha Mededa, and it's still, I heard it as a teenager, and I think about it quite often, that for a Portuguese woman, the greatest thing you could aspire to be was the grand president of the Sociedade Portuguesa Rainha Santa Isabel, because you were the top of something. You were the grand president. Yeah. You were in charge of a society of thousands of women throughout the entire state of California, Eureka to San Diego. And these women were going to look at you and, you were their guide for the year. What were we going to do to preserve our culture, our heritage, and then also move forward to make sure there is a organization in the next 100 years? So I think it had to be very instrumental, very important. And it was something, and not to take away from the other organizations, UPPC followed, I forget when, but a few years later, I'm sure they had the same drive as well. But it was, I think, for someone who could have come from nothing, thinking of, my great grandmothers, when they came over not knowing the language. They came over without any education. They came over just knowing how to grow grapes and how to cook and take care of people. And then all of a sudden to be part of an organization with bylaws and constitutions and rules and raising funds to have the grand president come visit, or raising funds for the different charity items, the giving back to their communities, giving back to their own members, etc. It was, the pinnacle of a life. Like I said, just short of a religion, God, and your family, SPRSI was up there, I would have to imagine.
Sure. And doing all this, indeed, I certainly can, I think all of us can identify with past President Madeira's statement to you, because other than SPRSI, and like you said, a few years later, UPPC, other than, those two organizations, in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and even into the 60s, the most you could aspire was to be, if you were married, was to be the first lady, was to be married to the president of another fraternal or a Portuguese organization other than fraternals, or Portuguese festa. That's all you could do. And with SPRSI, I would think, Tisha, that even at a local level, to be council president was important.
Oh, absolutely, because like you said, in a society of hierarchy, you could only be the Supreme President's first lady wife. I mean, not to say you're not doing a lot of work.
Sure.
And you're not doing the traveling, you're not making sure they're prepared, you're not helping, you're whatever. You're the backbone of the person trying to make their own foot in their own organization. They don't get recognized, most likely. But here in SPRSI, it was all about you, and it was something you accomplished on your own. No, I'm not going to say they didn't have help, but I know in the early years, not everybody did have the support of their spouses, because it wasn't the common thing to do. It wasn't the proper thing to do. Yeah. It wasn't the normal place for a woman to do something like that. So I think it was something that they got on their own and they got recognized. And I absolutely agree, council president. I remember when I became council president for Council 70 here in Selma, I think I was in my late teens. I think I was a senior in high school. So I graduated at 17. So I was roughly 17. And that was a great honor. I remember the grand president coming and I'm having to speak and have these books ready, and she's going to audit us. And I hope everything's in line, that the secretary did her job and the treasurer did her job. And I even panicked for a minute, like, what if this woman yells at me because these things aren't in order and I can't control them, and, but once it was all said and done, it was very exciting. It was nice to be honored. And you met a lot of women, obviously, throughout the state, because grand presidents come from all over the place.
Sure.
And then the people they travel with, people that would just come from your local councils even. We had deputies. I remember the first year I was a deputy, it was for the Carruthers Council, and it was Grand President Dorothy Stetsko. She's out of Fresno. She wanted to do something different and have new people take these deputy positions. And I got one, and I was there for the Carruthers Council, and I was nervous. I didn't know exactly what I was supposed to do, but it was an honor and it was a big thing. And they even treated you as a deputy. If I went to their council meetings, it was like, oh, what's your favorite food? What color corsage do you want? And I'm like, oh, I don't need that. I don't need those kind of things. I'm just happy to come and spend time with you and fellowship and sociability and, work for our society and see how I can help you, or to make sure that your council is strong. So every position, I think, was definitely a position of honor, and definitely something the person rose to. I mean, if you rose to the position of president of your local council, your members had to have liked you. You had to be a hard worker. You had to be intelligent. You had to know the rules. You had to know your floor work. You stepped the wrong way on those floors and those ladies would get you. You had to know your P's and Q's, dot your I's and cross your T's, so to speak. So I guess, being in that position, just knowing that everyone else in that council, what they're looking for you to for a year of leadership, that within itself was quite a bit, quite an accomplishment. And then, as we all know, for most organizations, secretaries are the backbones. Secretaries are in there 20, 50, 50 plus years. And they're the ones that also, help keep those councils running, not just with the minutes and finances sometimes and all of those types of things, but, they've been there so long, they become your history keepers. They are the guardians of the books and the guardians of the knowledge, and you turn to them quite a bit too. So those positions, I know now it's hard to find people to do it, but back then, we can read in our books that, there were runoffs and elections and nominations, and they wanted to hold on to those titles because that was a big title too. You obviously read, you wrote. So yes, I agree. I think any position you hold was probably a great honor, because the councils, there were multiple people that could have held it, but you were chosen, at least for that year, to hold it.
Yeah. And it was the only organization, or that, and of course, as you said, the UPBC, it were the only two organizations where you could, as a woman, hold a position like that. Eventually, of course, women started holding positions of secretary and of other positions, but very few became presidents of these organizations until well into almost the end of the 20th century. When I remember, I believe Rosie, as we call her, Silveira here from Tulare, was the very first lady president of Luso America. And this was already in the 1980s, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And so for such a long period of time, even when people came from the Azores, as like Maria Fernanda Simões and some of the other members that came post the Capelinhos volcano, so post 1960, let's say, even those folks, when they came here, those women did not have any other organizations that they could belong to and become presidents of these organizations. Certainly in the 1960s, it may have changed in the 1970s and 80s, but it certainly was not in the 1960s. So it's definitely very important. So 151 councils at one time.
Yeah,
that is a lot of councils. I mean, that's 151 cities in California, whether they are cities of 100,000 or 5,000. That was tremendous amount of traveling for people.
Absolutely. Like I said, I was grand president in 2008 was my first year. I visited 69 councils. We still had 69 active councils at that point. And with working and trying to get there. And, most of them were nice, and they had their visits on the weekends, because fortunately I didn't work weekends at the time. But some, our visit is always the second Tuesday of June, and you need to be here the second Tuesday of June. And it's working, getting work done, asking for time off. Luckily I had very gracious bosses at the time, and that was not an issue, but I can only imagine it wasn't that way for everybody. So I know I've heard stories of grand presidents taking years off of work for those that worked later. A lot of them tended to be retired. Maybe the first year they retired, they could work up the chairs as they were working. But at the time that they became grand president, that was also the year they retired. So they had the time to give and travel. And because not just your council visits do you have the other fraternal conventions to go to. There was a lot more then than there is now. But you had to do those. There was also the league. If you were grand president, you went to the league. I don't remember if they met monthly or quarterly, but you had to go to league meetings. I remember going when I was grand president. I think it stopped shortly after. You had the league, you had the fraternal congress that was not just the Portuguese organizations, but Knights of Columbus and Odd Fellows and, the German groups, whatever. They had their meetings as well. And then you had that yearly convention, and you had all these duties outside of just your organization as well. And then to be traveling, I remember one of my visits, I'm in San Diego one day for a visit. Next day I need to be in Visalia. For me, a 5-6 hour drive. But if they were to book their visits like that, back when the roads were not as fast, the cars were not as fast,
Sure.
or you're relying on a train schedule or a bus schedule, much more complicated. So I would say not necessarily more of a dedication, but definitely more of a trial and more hurdles to overcome than myself being in this century, so to speak, with all our modern conveniences. And then even now, more recently, having things like, I actually had my council meeting this morning, and it was done via Zoom. So I think we've talked before about how COVID has, it's, obviously not a fantastic thing, and has caused us great detriment as a society as a whole, but it's given us some options that have been there for years. And once you're forced to use them, opens up so many doors. They didn't have anything like this. You still had party lines even for telephones back when we started. You didn't have your own phone line.
Sure.
So to make a phone call was not even so simple. Most things were done by writing and letters, and now we get a letter in 3 days. Back then could have been weeks, Pony Express, so to speak. So
sure.
So quite an ordeal to have to, not an ordeal, but quite the challenges to have to travel for those that had to do the 151 councils. I remember she recently passed away last year, I believe. But she was our dean for many years, Hilda Rodriguez, and she was grand president in the 70s. And I learned a lot of my history from her. She took me under her wing. She was one of the many when I was going up the line. And we had great conversations. And when she had a visit in a council or in an area, she tried to get her visits close together, and she would live in that area for the week. And one of her highest moments, I think it was close to 400 members she put in for that year. And this wasn't necessarily members that people gave to her. It was her, pounding the pavement and, obviously getting referrals and things like that. But, putting in that effort, and she's away from her husband, away from her son, but she was so connected to the organization, and it meant so much to her. And she had risen to the ranks of the honor of, grand president. She was going to do her best, as we all want to do. And she spent literally, she told me, a week in every area when she had a visit. I love my organization, but there was no way at my age I could have spent a week in every area.
Sure. Yeah, that's a lot of commitment. Of course, things were different, and times were different, and people's priorities, of course, were different, and time schedules were not probably as demanding sometimes as they are now, and work-related issues. As we come to getting close to the end of our conversation, a couple of things that we're commemorating, of course, Portuguese Immigrant Week in California. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, especially today, being International Women's Day, and to archive this conversation for the Portuguese Oral History Archive at PBBI at Fresno State. But how do you see us, and specifically, of course, to SPRSI, but I think it's a community endeavor. How do we pass this great, other than this conversation that hopefully folks will listen to and watch it, not just today, but hopefully some students will be analyzing it 40 or 50 years from now. That's the whole idea of the archive. But how do we pass these stories? How do we pass this rich history of what I call the women's movement in California, and it was led by SPRSI, whether we like it or not. I mean, there's nothing to like and nothing not to like, but I mean, whether we kind of look at, oh, it was an altar society that had its evolution, but it was women in power in a particular time that women did not have any power. And so how do we pass this and all of this rich history, all of these stories, all of these anecdotes, and all of this to the younger generations? And how do you see SPRSI? I know it's part of the Luso financial team now, but you have been able to keep your own identity. It seems like the organization. How do you see us passing this on, and how do you see SPRSI not losing its identity?
So I think what you're doing here, obviously not just our conversation, but the whole thing that the whole movement you have started, along with Fresno State and PBBI, of the oral history and these WebExes, webinars, etc., that are being recorded. I do hope that in 40, 100 years, someone is looking at this and thinking about, well, what was it like in 2022? Let alone what we were talking about today, which goes back to 1898 and 30 women that an altar society grew into. I mean, kids these days, and I'll speak for, my relatives, my cousins, my nephew, etc. They don't read. They don't, listen. They prefer to listen to a podcast or listen to an audiobook versus read a book. So I think we've done our best at, and I don't think we should stop it, but I think we should still have a written history for those that are able to do so and have a great gift like yourself, for writing. But I think it is going to be paramount, these videos and these sessions and these recordings that you do, even the verbal ones, like the oral history project as it started. It didn't start as a video, or my first one was a tape recorder, a little more than a tape recorder, but you know what I mean. So it's just the voice, just the vocal. And if you look at other nationalities, the Native American culture, it just stems down from talking over and over and over and making sure that the next generation hears the stories over and over and over so that they're able to continue them on. So I think that's very important. And I think thanks to the age that we live in, with having the technology to be able to record these items like we are today, or that you've been doing for a few years now, is going to, again, be paramount, instrumental, and absolutely necessary in order to be able to have some kind of just a recollection in the future. I wish that people had thought about we do, like I said, we do have written things from those that were around in the 19th century, the first 1898.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I just want to, for you not to lose your train of thought, although you don't, you're young, you never lose your train of thought. It's when you get my age. But what, so SPRSI does have some written documents. These are kept in safe places and stored. And these are things that we can archive in the future and historians can look at it. So there are some written documents, right?
Oh yeah, we have, at the Luso office in Dublin, there's a little history room that's open. Anyone can go in and take a look. There's pictures on display, there's items on display. But one of the things when we packed up the office that I loved going through was every month the organization posted a bulletin. And in that bulletin has everything everybody was doing for the month: the Grand President's travel, her reports, names, council numbers, when they were getting visits from dignitaries from Portugal, from the Azores, from cardinals, bishops, etc. It's all documented in these bulletins. So they took a great, beyond starting the organization, I want to say the first bulletin, the earliest one I think I saw might have been 1910. So there's quite a bit there, and we continued those on through 2008. They went from monthly to quarterly at some point.
Sure.
But we still did the same thing. President wrote up their little report so you could see where they traveled when people passed away. So if you're doing genealogy and you want to find out, you might see your grandmother's name in there, that she was a member of Council 112, and that might get you to want to look up and see if there's still a council in your area, or how you can continue on your family legacy, so to speak. So I think it was great beneficial. I know I enjoyed reading them from time to time, just picking up the old ones when I would be in the office and I couldn't be in the boardroom for one reason or another. You just go to the history room there and pick up an old bulletin and just start reading it. And they were in English pretty early on as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's great for someone like myself that does not.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's we're very fortunate that we have those.
Right. And so you feel that, and it's a good analogy that you use, the Native American community, because they've gone, of course, through so much, and yet it is a very rich tradition that just keep on telling the story. So storytelling and telling these stories and registering these stories, it might be one way that the younger generation will want to know more about the history of their forefathers. And the history of their forefathers, not just what happened in Portugal, with a king or a queen, 400 years ago or 500 years ago. It's what happens today with Portuguese Americans, of any generation in California. We're continuing the narrative. We'll be a very poor community once the narrative dies, and hopefully it never will. So telling the stories,
Great.
and how do you feel as far as do you think that even though part of a conglomerate, for lack of a better word, is the Luso, that SPRSI has been able to keep their identity alive?
Yes, we have. Now, the decision was made that, we're not going to, we will, in August, we will install our last Grand President as it stands as part of the organization. But it doesn't mean SPRSI goes away. Sure. Sunday, we had an official visit here in Selma for the Hanford and Fresno Council. And, sometimes it's a little gloomy, and the ladies get a little gloomy with the thought, because, we were told, 4 years ago, maybe, but now it's close. It's really close. And so now it hits them a little more, and they think it's done. And so I had to remind them that in 1898, 30 women sat around a table. And that day we had 25 women sitting around a table, and they were able to, make an organization that lasted 124 years. They started it in a time where everything was against them. Here, we're our worst enemies. Our negativity is what will actually make us close. We can keep our activities, we can keep our councils, we can find ways to do it. We're starting to build the relationship with the Confraria of Santa Clara Nova in Coimbra, where our patroness saint's body lays still to today. And several of us make our pilgrimage every even year. I'll be going back there in July, celebrating the 750th anniversary of her birth, our patroness, Queen Saint Isabel, with the procession. So there's items like that still keeps us alive. We can still, we have an anniversary every year, which we're going to be celebrating next week in San Diego. We can still do that. I have made a commitment that we can have it here in Selma every year and still gather. We can still do our charity work. We can still do whatever for St. Isabel. You don't have to have necessarily
the hierarchy.
Of leadership and titles. You can get back to that, as we call today, grassroots. And start the initiative over again in the modern world of the 21st century. What will it hold for us? And it still involves keeping the youth. SPRSI started youth relatively early. We gave out our first scholarship in 1950. So youth, they realized in the 40s that youth were, important to their future. And I'm personally glad that they did. And they were innovative. Whoever was running the organization in the 40s and 50s to think about that. Like I mentioned before, my great-grandmother was part of that. So it's still today, kids have so much going on, as we've talked about,
Sure.
sports, and here we're agriculture, you have FFAs, 4-H's, and you have soccer clubs, and you have sports, and you have academics, which have their own clubs as well. So there's always something for kids to do, but we have to make sure that we instill with our children, and when I say children, I don't have any biological children at the moment, but, like with my nephew, he is an SPRSI member because they do allow men since we merged into LUSO. So he's an SPRSI member, and I make sure he knows his roots, and when he was younger, he'd, yell out, "I'm an SPRSI member." He's all proud when I take him to an official visit. He's still excited to go. So for me, it's keeping him involved, even though he's not a woman, but maybe, maybe I'll have more nieces one day, or I'll have children one day, or my cousins, as they have children, we can keep it involved in them no matter where they're at. They're not even in California mostly anymore, but it's something you can take with you everywhere. SPRSI can be literally everywhere.
And yeah, indeed. And there's evolution. I mean, it was a all-women society for a particular reason in 1898, but today it can be a man and woman society. It can be, as you said, it can be the idea is, of course, to continue to celebrate the spirit of these women in 1898, and has continued for 124 years. But now, we're a different world. I mean, women still don't have the power that they should, but it is a long way from 1898. And so I think, and the way it's going to evolve is going to be, everyone together, independently if you're a man or a woman. And so, and the idea, of course, to honor the patron saint, Rainha Santa Isabel. Just in the last couple of minutes, you said that you were going back for the 750th anniversary now in July of this year. That's an awesome commemoration. Obviously, you've gone back before. I know that. Tell me a little bit about that experience, and also, more than the personal experience as well, how important is it? Because I'm a firm believer that we need to come up, and California, the community, not that everybody is rich. I'm not rich by any stretch of the imagination, but the community is okay. The community is, we have folks in need, obviously, but we also have folks who have, and our organizations have, some of them have, a pretty good amount of money. And a way to make some funds. I'm a firm believer that in the future we need to think a little bit more about some kind of a grant or scholarship or program that, with all of our organizations together, that maybe we can get every year 15 to 20 students or young people in California that have no possibility of going to Portugal, of going there to see the land of their grandparents or their great grandparents. How important to you, Tisha, to kind of, although you've been raised in this society and in the Portuguese American community, thanks to your grandmother, who we honor today on her 97th birthday, but how important to you was that trip going back to Coimbra when you went, and also I know you went to the Azores, to their homeland. How important to you is those connections? Did that kind of, build up even a bigger fire within you to continue this, or not?
No, it absolutely did. Going to Portugal, going to the Azores, is always on the bucket list, as far as somewhere to go, like Ireland would be now as well. It's on the bucket list. I haven't been there, but, I had no clue what to expect. And I think that's what made it even more solemn and more revitalizing. The people there in Coimbra, they treat Queen Saint Isabel as if she's never left. They take her image, which is this beautiful statue that, 15, 20 men carry, and they walk in such a way that it looks as if she is walking down the streets in this procession. and they have the banners out that they put out for monarchy, and she's returning to her people. And again, this is a woman that hasn't been around for 700 600 and some years, but everyone treats her as if we knew her yesterday, and she's coming for a visit. And it's just eye-opening, the people that have their promesas, and so they're walking barefoot, they're walking on their knees, and they're the cobble road still that we're walking on, to see their dedication and their devotion for whatever their sacrifice is, as they're hurting themselves to make this walk, so that hopefully they get some kind of blessing, or as a thank you for a blessing they already received. So it definitely revitalized everything for myself, to where I realized that SPRSI was outside of my council in San Mateo, was outside of my state of California, was out of my country of the United States of America. It was everywhere, because SPRSI is Saint Isabel, and Saint Isabel is in Portugal, and not even just Portugal. She's recognized throughout many countries. But to see how they recognize her, and we have a window there, and that's what kind of started us going back. They needed help repairing the window. We used to always send money, and then when we merged, those funds stopped every year. And so they were like, hey, there's a little nick and a little damage, and it's a stained glass window. It's a massive stained glass window. And even to see that and know that in 1950s, what the women had to do to pay for that and get it there, and what made them think of doing it to celebrate their 50th anniversary, and how the people there have adorned that window, and often wondered. I had several conversations with people there that, I probably should have recorded. We all have recording devices now with our phones, and we probably should think about that more often, because there was an older man, probably my age, but he goes, I went to that church, the monastery, for mass every Sunday, and I looked at that window and I often wondered, who is this SPRSI in California? What were they? And so when he sees us, he puts an image as we're walking in these processions, and he talked to us for hours and hours. And just what it meant to see that window. And you would not think that something as simple as a window, that most of us have beautiful stained glass windows in the churches we go to every Sunday, and we're just like, oh, it's a stained glass window. But this window was, life defining for this man, and it's something, he always wondered about, what is California about? So then I'm here on the reverse, what is Portugal about? What are the Azores about? So to see where my family came from when I went to the Azores, to me, it's a beautiful country, and I think, why would you leave? But obviously the opportunities are not as great. I know there were volcano eruptions, and that's what brought a lot of the immigrants here. My family came for better opportunities, to not have to go to Angola for war, to be honest with you as well. But to see the country they left was beautiful, and they loved it. And it was not an easy decision, but they did what was better for somebody else, which is, what St. Isabel was about. It wasn't about what about me. It was what can I do for my people. It's what SPRSI has become. It's not about me. It's what can we do in St. Isabel's name, in St. Isabel's honor. How can I imitate the beauty of her virtues and do something here locally? We actually just started. I was given the opportunity in January. We have a kitchen that does Wednesday meals for the community. You need a meal, you go there on Wednesday, you get a meal. And so I called my SPRSI family up, and oddly enough, we realized when we got there and we were cooking, we were all past grand presidents. And we're making this meal for 30 people. And that's exactly what St. Isabel would do. We're giving our time, we're giving our money, we're giving our culinary skills, some better than others. And we're making a meal for people, and we're eating with them, and we're enjoying their company. And, it doesn't have to be grand gestures, it can be little things. But I think you have a fabulous idea. I would encourage, and I encouraged everybody on Sunday when I was there, because I am going back this year. It'll be my third time going back. COVID stopped my 2020 visit, or it would have been the fourth time I'm going back. But it's so moving. It takes you back to a time that is just so different from here. It's almost like a time warp in a way. You're walking through a window, as you get off that plane, you're in a whole different world. When you get into Coimbra and they're celebrating Queen St. Isabel, and just amazing. Tens of thousands of people walking down the streets that she walked. you know, how many years ago? And then you can go visit, you know, the monastery where her body lays. You can go to the last castle they had for her. So much. I think anyone should have I know most people have the desire and the want. And I think if there's a way to help people with funds, I think you definitely have people that would be willing to do it. And, you know, I was once told by a wise man, Mr. Ralph Owls out of Kingsburg, when we were talking about Festa collections one day, doesn't matter what someone gives you, if they're giving you what they give you, it all adds up at the end. So, you know, you can start a grassroots effort and everybody just keeps their change going. You never know how many kids you might get to Portugal and eventually.
Yep, we need to work on that. Well, thank you so much, Tisha. We took a little bit longer than I know that you have another commitment. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. That wonderful story there at the end of you guys cooking and getting together the SPRSI family for those who want a free meal. I think that Queen Isabel would like that very, very much, and I think she'd like you. So. I think she'd like you if she met you. I think she would be very impressed, as I am. Thank you so much. We appreciate you so much. Appreciate all you do, and happy Portuguese Immigrant Week to you, and keep on doing what you do. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, and to you too. And please keep on doing what you're doing.
Take care.
You too.